All right, I think it's time that we get the show on the road here. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. This is Mark from the National Weather Service in Pendleton, sitting in my lovely home here on telework, and happy to have all of you join us today to discuss what we expect in the next few months. I also have Ed Townsend joining me. He is our new Science and Operations Officer. Ed arrived about a month and a half ago and is quickly spinning up and learning parts of our area and the different diverse weather conditions we experience. So we're really happy to have him. He comes from North Platte, so his severe weather expertise was especially appreciated this last weekend as we had quite an interesting event, which we will touch on here in the presentation. So let's go on and get right into it. We've had kind of an interesting May. When we started off the month, we were experiencing worsening drought conditions across much of the Columbia Basin, down into Central Oregon, especially parts of southwestern Oregon. And we had kind of an interesting, what we call anomalous or unusual weather pattern from about mid-May on through the end of the month, where we had these repeat storm systems that came in and brought heavy rains. The heaviest rains were experienced generally west of the Cascades in Washington. But we did have kind of an interesting event there, about 2 weeks ago, where a large area of low pressure moved to our east. And usually that brings drier, cooler weather, and it certainly was cooler. But there was so much moisture with that system that we ended up with a lot of wraparound moisture on the backside that affected eastern Washington and extended all the way down into northeast Oregon. So we actually ended up with a pretty significant flooding event there in the southern and northern Blue Mountains, up into southeast Washington and much of northeastern Oregon, even over into the Wallowas and the Eagle Cap Wilderness of Wallowa County, where we saw fairly significant river rises and rainfall amounts 2 to 5 inches in some areas. So really impressive, extremely unusual for May especially. I've worked in a number of offices across the country, and the only thing I could really compare it to, it rained for almost 18 hours, it seemed like, here in Pendleton. And it was almost like a tropical event. Tropical storms, they come in, bring a lot of moisture, and it just kind of rains and rains and rains and rains. And that's kind of what it reminded me of, although it was a little bit cooler. But we have obviously dried out since then. And we are seeing drought conditions continue to actually deteriorate, oddly enough, in the Columbia Basin of Oregon, Washington, and again, Southwest Oregon, also showing that extreme drought there. So one thing we are looking at in the next few days is another active storm pattern, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Now, speaking of drought, we always start worrying about the potential for our fire season to be more active than usual, less active, whatever it may be. And because of those rains, we've actually seen some encouraging things anyway in terms of some of our mountain zones and where we might expect to see increased wildfire activity. So this first image here on the bottom left, this is showing the May departure from normal precipitation. So anything you see that is green, blue, purple, that's where we had much above normal precipitation. These areas where you're seeing really no color at all or just kind of a grayish color, that's where we were pretty much near normal. And the areas that are in the oranges and the reds, kind of picking out an area here over in Idaho and southern Montana, those areas saw below average precipitation or below normal precipitation for the month of May. So this really kind of dovetails off what we were just talking about with the systems that we had back in May and all the rainfall we had, especially along the Cascades and just to the west slopes of the Cascades in Washington. And again, far eastern Washington into the Blues and Wallowa Mountains of northeast Oregon. Again, a very active period. May's, we do tend to get a decent amount of precipitation, but we had a really active storm pattern and just these repeat rounds of rain, some thunderstorms, even some snow at times above 6,000-7,000 feet. So we're still keeping that active pattern, and that really beat back the drought in a lot of those areas, and is also going to result in a later onset of drier fuels that are favorable for wildfires. So based on that, the significant wildfire potential outlook has been updated, and you can see the area. A lot of our areas still, we're a little concerned, obviously, about increased wildfire potential across the Columbia Basin in Washington and Oregon, which is not unusual at all. And of course, those areas where the drought is still pretty bad in southwestern and southern Oregon. But you do see these areas that, we're expecting kind of a delayed onset to critical fuel conditions and wildfire, favorable conditions for wildfires. And of course, that lines up well with this rain pattern where we had all this excessive rainfall, the flooding in Northeast Oregon, and also abundant rainfall across Western Washington and far Northwest Oregon. So while we did have some flooding, that does tend to lead to a lesser concern, at least in the near term, for wildfire conditions. But we do have to continue to watch the basin and the Cascades in southern and central Oregon especially. Okay, so moving on from fires. A lot of people, when we get to this time of year, they know that this is the time of year that we get thunderstorms. And they start to wonder, well, is this going to be a bad year for storms? Is it not? Obviously, we just had an event that really is almost historic, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. So we've kind of already had a pretty bad severe weather season, to be honest, and that all happened in just one day. But the truth is, every year we get questions like this. We're going to have thunderstorm days. We're going to have days where we have severe thunderstorms. We're going to have days where we just have showers. There's not really a good way to predict a seasonal trend in severe weather, at least not one that is consistently reliable. The models that we use to assess conditions for severe weather generally are only accurate out to about 5, maybe 7 days at best. We can get a general idea of a favorable pattern, especially if we're using what we call an ensemble. An ensemble is basically smashing together hundreds of runs of the same model, just using different initial conditions to start that model. So we can get a general idea about 7 to 10 days out and say, okay, when you're 7 to 10 days out, you're not going to be like, oh, we're going to have tornadoes or we're going to have major winds. But you can at least say, this pattern is looking very similar to one we had in the past that produced severe weather across our area. So that we have some idea, and we can kind of start messaging that a little bit. But our confidence really starts to increase about, 3 to 5 days out. That's when we really kind of start getting a better handle on things. And that's when you'll see things like the partner emails we send out, just giving you guys a heads up that we have a pattern that's going to favor severe weather. And, you need to pay attention, especially on this stretch of time. As we get even closer, and if we're really worried about a more significant severe event, that's when we may actually go into, a live webinar, a live briefing, to get into more of the details, the nitty-gritty of what we're expecting. So basically, we can't tell you how bad the season's going to be, although based on what we had on Saturday, I can tell you it's been a pretty rough season for severe weather across our area. It's one of the worst days, according to my MIC, that he's experienced, and he's been here for 17 years. So apparently it only takes 2 years for me being here to have a major event. But nonetheless, we can't really tell with any skill how, what we're going to have going forward, how much worse it's going to get. But I did want to kind of recap the event that we did have on May 30th. And, as I said before, I've worked in a lot of different offices across the country, including Tampa and Tallahassee, Florida, which that was more of a tropical focus. But I did work in Norman, Oklahoma for about 4.5 years. And of course, that's Tornado Alley, USA and everything else. And some of the storm structure that we saw coming in on social media that was shared with us via email looked every bit as impressive as anything I ever saw working in Oklahoma. So, we really just don't get the ingredients for severe weather like we did on Saturday all that often. I would say probably a once in 15 to 25 year event. So let me back out here. I'm going to stop the presentation briefly and just kind of show you what a summary of the warning situation looked like. So we issued 17 severe thunderstorm warnings altogether. They started down in Central Oregon, actually down in Klamath County, where they had one single thunderstorm, what we would call a supercell, That's a rotating thunderstorm. And those storms are particularly dangerous because they tend to produce some of the most severe weather. They also persist for a very, very long time. So that storm developed down in Klamath County and moved northward into Deschutes, Jefferson, all the way up through Wasco counties. And some of the most extreme damage we saw occurred just to the southwest of Madras, between Metolius and Culver. There was a lot of questions as to whether or not we might have had a tornado based on the severity of the damage, but we did go down and do a survey and determined it was all straight line wind. But impressively, we had a couple of high tension electrical towers that were actually compromised. The tops of them blew off, and if you go in and look at what kind of wind speeds it takes to do that, you're talking about wind speeds in the neighborhood of 100 to 115 miles per hour. So that's getting up there. I mean, we have had events in the past where we actually had a measured wind speed of, I believe, 117 miles per hour. That was back in 2006. So we're talking about, a very, very rare event, extremely significant wind speeds. I mean, it doesn't take a tornado to cause life-threatening winds, and we definitely saw that on Saturday. If you're in, especially a manufactured home, mobile home, even just kind of maybe not the best built home, and you're getting winds that strong, it's going to be destroyed. And we were lucky that we didn't have any major injuries or anything like that, because it was mostly over the rural country out there, southwest of Madras. But really, really impressive stuff. As you can see by the warning polygons here, you see they kind of start down in Central Oregon, they kind of migrate northward. We had additional activity that developed further east and spread northeastward and really covered almost all of north central and northeast Oregon. And it finally kind of slowed down as it got into southern Washington. But large hail up to golf ball size, all within this area, and wind speeds, damaging winds ranging from 60 to, like I said, 115 miles per hour. So again, a very, very rare event for our area. And we certainly hope that's the last of it for this year, because that was an extremely busy day. And, we just don't like to see that kind of damage. But meteorologically, very, very interesting, very, very rare. All right, let's go back to the slideshow here. So what do we look for when we look for a favorable thunderstorm pattern? What we're typically looking for is what we call an upper trough or an upper level low pressure system. And usually for favorable thunderstorm conditions in our area, it would be off the Oregon, Washington, sometimes Northern California coast. And so what that allows for is a transport of a lot of moisture off the Pacific into the Northwest. One of the big limiting factors for us for severe weather is we don't typically get a lot of low-level moisture. It's hard to get that in here, and that's what we saw Saturday. So, typically we have a good mid-level moisture stream. We just happen to have a favorable wind direction to get a lot of low-level moisture in here Saturday. That doesn't happen too often. But nonetheless, if we've got a jet stream structure like this where it's coming off the Pacific over our area this time of year, we have enough heating during the day that we get what we call instability. And because we have instability, especially over the mountains with the wind circulations that happen during the daytime, we'll tend to see thunderstorms start to develop as winds move up the side of mountains. We call that topographic lift. It's basically just winds that are going up the side slopes of mountains that causes air to condense and form clouds, and eventually you can get thunderstorms if you have enough instability. If you have optimal moisture and you have this kind of a configuration, that's when you get the severe weather threat. And so, we had that happen Saturday. We are looking at another storm system coming in this coming weekend, like Friday, Saturday, and moving kind of east of the area Sunday into Monday. Not looking as impressive as what we had on Saturday by any means, but there will be at least a limited chance of a few stronger thunderstorms. And I would say, somewhere down from the central Oregon Cascades over into the eastern mountains of Oregon and southeast Washington could be an area to watch for. Again, not looking anywhere near as significant as what we had Saturday, but it is something to keep an eye on. And it does show that we're still in this active storm pattern. So what does a non-active storm pattern look like? Well, that would occur if we had a large ridge, what we call a ridge of high pressure that developed over the area. And this is when we start worrying. We have this kind of a setup is when we really start worrying about the potential for increased wildfire danger. Because when high pressure comes in, you have sinking air, you don't have a lot of clouds. In fact, you have almost none because it's so stable. And it can get much hotter because you have air sinking, and that causes the air to warm. You can't cool off very much except for at night. And so your humidities are perpetually pretty low, and they're going to get, very low in the afternoon as it heats up. And then if you've got, a little kicker that comes in and brings increased winds, that combination of low humidity and gusty winds is what we really get concerned about. Fortunately, over most of the area, we've had a fair amount of rain going back really to February. So the fuels aren't totally critical or near critical just yet. But as we move into, the next couple of months, especially July and August, our, typical fire season, if you will, that's when the fuels get a lot drier. And if we end up with, an area of high pressure developing over the region and no cloud cover, nothing to really keep humidities up, that's when you really start worrying about the potential for wildfire. So there's always something. If you have this configuration, you're going to worry about thunderstorms and lightning and things like that. This configuration is going to be more just low humidity, possibly gusty winds, that kind of thing. There is kind of an in-betweener, though. Occasionally, we'll get what we call dry thunderstorms, and people are like, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense to people in Florida, especially because there's nothing dry down there at all. But in the Northwest, because a lot of times your cloud bases are so high, you can have thunderstorms develop that are producing lightning, but by the time the precipitation, gets down to the ground, there's nothing left. It all evaporates. And that can be really bad too, because you can have really gusty winds underneath a thunderstorm that has no rain coming out of it. And so naturally, that's a really bad situation because the lightning starts fires, and then this evaporation process where you have all the precipitation evaporating out of the cloud results in gusty winds. So that's a very, very bad configuration for thunderstorms. And it's hard, again, I'll go back to what I said. We can generally denote a favorable pattern for thunderstorm activity about 7 to 10 days out. Dry thunder is a little bit more of a beast when it comes to trying to forecast. It's very dependent on a number of different factors. I will say the Storm Prediction Center, which is in Norman, Oklahoma, they do severe forecasts for the entire country. They also do fire weather forecasts, or fire weather outlooks, I should say, for the entire country. And if they're sensing a pattern favoring dry thunder, they will actually denote that in their outlook. And we certainly will too if we're seeing that pattern. So something to keep in mind. So what's this seasonal outlook look like for this year? Well, it's kind of a big question mark. We can obviously confirm we've had a really bad severe weather event. So we're definitely already more active than we have been in a number of years. But going forward, are we going to have more severe storms or strong storms? I can guarantee you we're going to have some strong storms and probably another severe thunderstorm or two with fairly high confidence. But exactly when's it going to happen? It's kind of a big question mark. And now it is Ed's turn to present. So I'm going to actually turn the presentation over to him. Give me just 1 second. I want to double check and make sure folks are still hearing me okay. Looks like I'm not getting any complaints. All right. All right, Ed, it's all yours.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Ed Townsend with the National Weather Service in Pendleton. I'm the new Science and Operations Officer. Is everyone able to see my screen? Hopefully you are seeing the June climate outlook. So going forward right now, wetter than average conditions are forecast for central and northeast Oregon and south central Washington. You can kind of see that on your right, where we have greater odds for above average precipitation. For temperatures, that's kind of a different story. There are equal chances over the area, and this is noted by the white color. This means that there is no tilt necessarily in the odds toward any outcome of warm, cool, or average temperatures. More or less all are equally likely. Now, this doesn't mean that below average or above average temperatures won't occur, or that even average conditions are favorable. Generally, what we're seeing here is that this is a pretty difficult forecast situation, and there's not much of a climate signal to favor one outcome more than the other. Thus, forecast for us is the same 33.3% odds to all three outcomes. We're kind of stand out in contrast to the rest of the country, where there is a really modest to moderate tilt in the odds towards the warmer than average temperatures. Looking into June, at least for early June, as we're seeing right now in parts of late May, we're kind of under the influence of troughing. So an area of low pressure extending from the Gulf of Alaska to the Pacific Northwest, with ridging more downstream for at least the first part of the month. For context, in Pendleton, average June high temperatures around 78. And for June, we still around near 1 inch of average precipitation, 0.98. Important thing to keep in mind is really late June to July is when we climatologically arrive in our kind of dry period, dry pattern. Looking ahead to summer, July, August, and part of September, we are seeing higher odds for above average or above normal temperatures for our area of eastern Oregon and south central Washington. And there's a slight tilt for below normal precipitation. The average highs in July, August, and September were still in the upper 80s, around 88 and 87. With September, we start to cool down to around the mid 70s. Again, we're kind of going to be arriving in our dry period starting in July, where we only average about 1/3 of an inch of precipitation in July and August. Starting in September, our average precipitation goes up to just a little over 1/2 inch, around 5/700ths. One of the big factors in the climate outlook is, especially in the wintertime, is the phase of ENSO, and that's whether or not we have El Nino or La Nina conditions. ENSO is important because, particularly of its phase, because it's relatively predictable impact. Right now we are ENSO neutral conditions, and that does not mean the weather will be average, it just means that other non-ENSO forces will be influenced the weather, and you can kind of see in this tug of war, generally we have El Nino on one side, and then we have these other factors, different climate patterns, as well as just the weather itself pulling on, doing a tug of war. So what's going to happen is that these long-term trends will become more of a key predictor, and other climate patterns, and unfortunately change faster than El Nino or La Nina phases, and therefore are harder to predict weeks in advance. So the forecast that the Climate Prediction Center is relying more on long-term trends, other patterns, model guidance, and statistical tools. Something to keep in mind with all these outlooks is that, weather is what you get, climate is what you expect. So we're looking, they're pretty broad in nature. We're covering, for instance, 3 months in time for July, August, and September. So there's definitely times during that period you can expect below, above average temperatures or precipitation. Looking forward to the seasonal forecast, right now we're in La Nina, we're in neutral. And again, neutral just means we don't have that predictable influence from El Nino. And notice something though, is that this is one common index as we look at the temperature anomaly or difference from normal, and we're right around 0.5, and that's generally the threshold for an El Nino. But the most important thing is ENSO is a coupled system involving both the tropical Pacific Ocean and the atmosphere. And right now, we do not expect the surface to continue warming in the tropical Pacific Ocean. So we're not seeing that characteristics of El Nino responding. And that was the case this past winter. And so that's the one little caveat regarding the 0.5 threshold for El Nino or minus 0.5 for La Nina. Right now, the forecast is generally trending to continue a ENSO neutral phase, with a potential for tilt towards La Nina this upcoming winter. Something you may be hearing is a talking point that every year that started from an ENSO neutral winter like we just had has never been followed by a La Nina winter. The most important point from that is that this isn't to say it's not impossible, it's just something we haven't observed, and that goes back since 1950. Again, La Nina is pretty important just because we would have some more predictable influence on what to expect for the winter, if that is the case, and we do tilt towards that. With La Nina episodes, we see shifts in the pattern of the jet stream in the mid-latitudes, and this affects where storms develop. La Nina episodes feature generally a wavy-like jet stream, and for our region, that corresponds generally to above average precipitation and snowfall, and slightly cooler than average temperatures. Important to note, this is just the average snowfall patterns for all La Nina years, and we see while above average snowfall is present, not every La Nina event is the same. So you got to take that in context. I will now give it back to the organizer, Mark. Mark, it still looks like you are on
Sorry
mute.
about that. Yep, I was muted and I was talking for about a minute there. I was just saying thanks for delving into some of the more climatological aspects of what goes into our outlooks for summer and winter for that matter. Certainly we get a little bit more sciencey when it comes to those climate oscillations, but they do have a great bearing on exactly what happens with our sensible weather. So that's why we like to touch on those. Just a couple quick reminders here before we close. The National Weather Service has put together a team of fantastic graphic artists and content experts, and they've actually assembled this cadre of resources for safety. And so of course we're going into summer, so summer safety is obviously the topic that's most appropriate right now. But you'll notice at the bottom here, this is, we got one example of what one of those graphics looks like with the look before you lock. But below that, they actually have links to a number of different seasonal safety campaigns, including winter weather, springtime, severe weather, as well as things we see in the fall, like strong wind events. So really some great resources there. I encourage all of you to take a look at that. These are great for sharing on your social media accounts. Really aesthetically pleasing, simple, easy to understand, easy to read graphics. Also, I would say 80 to 90% of these are also available in Spanish. And so if you would like a link to that, just send either one of us an email and we can get that to you. We have a Spanish translation team that works to translate all these graphics into Spanish as well. And we know we have a fairly sizable non-English speaking population across our region. So some really great stuff there if you're looking to promote safety in your organization. And one other thing I want to remind folks is that, we are happy to provide weather support for events. Now, this example here is from the Tri-City Waterfalls, which we understand has been postponed. But, should it be rescheduled, we would absolutely love to be on site there and support those folks with pertinent weather information. We know we're in this whole COVID-19 atmosphere right now, and we're not exactly sure how that's going to affect us going into the late summer and the fall. A number of large events have been either canceled or postponed. We understand that. But, on the chance that things improve and, your local authority or state government decides that, restrictions can be eased and we can start kind of getting back to a quote unquote sense of normalcy, that's when some of these events may start to get rescheduled and things like that. And we just want to remind you that, we're here for you. We're here to provide weather information that will hopefully keep the folks that are attending and also the organizers and event planners and safety officials safe. So we can do that in a number of forms. We can, obviously the example here is us actually on site in person at the event. But more commonly, we do assistance virtually, either by email briefings or by contact by phone and just verbal briefings as we're seeing things deteriorate or seeing threatening weather conditions come in. There is a Google form if you want to try, your hand at that. There's a link at the bottom there, and I can also send out that link with maybe a PDF of the slides here once the webinar is concluded. But you're also always welcome to call our office or send us an email with details on the event and, what you're looking at, what your critical thresholds are, what are you most concerned about. So just a quick reminder on that. And I think with that, we appreciate you watching today, and I will unmute everybody so that if we have any questions, we can go ahead and answer those. Just 1 second here. Give me a second to unmute you.